Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld, Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and this video is about playing conventional Craftworlds, or to put it another way, it's about playing without expert crafters. I think that competitive Craftworlds players disagree about a lot, but one of the things that I think pretty much everybody agrees about is that the custom Craftworld options that are in the Phoenix Rising book and our Psychic Awakening book are just objectively better than any of the conventional Craftworlds faction bonuses currently available in a pre-9th edition Codex world. One of these custom Craftworld traits in particular, Expert Crafters, that allows a unit to reroll both a hit roll and a wound roll, both in the shooting phase and in the fight phase, I think is also universally agreed upon to just kind of be the best. That isn't to say that we might not have multiple detachments in our army, only one of which is making use of crafters, but nevertheless, there's just no doubt that this particular bonus is the most popular for competitive play. I also think that if you are a Craftworlds player trying to hold your head up high and even tournament play at your local store, it's probably quite frustrating if you want to play Ulthwe or Biel-Tan or whatever to get online and look for some tips and advice at a time when, let's be honest, Craftworlds need all of the help that they can get. If you're playing Craftworlds competitively, you're playing 40k on hard mode. And most of the advice online, including on my own channel and website, is geared towards the idea that players are going to be flexible about what sub-faction bonuses they choose, and that they will be on board with the idea of running a custom Craftworld, even if they have a Ulthwe paint scheme or whatever. And so this video is for all of you Craftworld purists and conventional Craftworld loyalists. I see you, and you too can play competitive 40k without betraying your aesthetic duty to your paint scheme. So this video, I'm going to start off with an introduction about just sort of generally how to play as a Craftworlds player without crafters, what sorts of additional considerations you need to address that maybe typical strategy guys on the internet or whatever are not taking into account because they're assuming that you're willing to use this trait. And then I'm going to talk specifically about each Craftworld. And in the description of the video, I have noted the time signature for each individual conventional Craftworld. So if you're an Iyanden player and you're not interested in sitting through my thoughts on Biel-Tan, Ulthwe, Saim-Hann, then you don't have to. You can, but I would advise you to listen to the introduction in which I talk about sort of the fundamental principles involved in playing without custom Craftworld bonuses. And then when we get to the end of that, I'm going to talk about Ulthwe first. And if you want, you can just skip to your Craftworld. Alternatively, there is a text-based version of this video with most of the same information, some of it verbatim, on my website. I will also link that in the video description. Okay. So here's the good news, right? Although there's no doubt that Crafters is among the most powerful faction bonus in the game, and when we get our Codex, guys, do not expect this to stick around. I suspect that probably there will be something like this, and it will be you reroll either a hit roll or a wound roll, or maybe you reroll just a wound roll, and it won't be as good, hands down. So Crafters is great. It's one of the most powerful bonuses in the game. Space Elves need all the help they can get. But a good player with a carefully constructed list should be able to take a pass on custom Craftworld bonuses and still have almost as good a competitive chance as any Craftworlds list can have right now. Because as far as what a player actually needs to do to win the game, that is scoring primary and secondary objectives, most of the relevant units and tactics work just about as well for those purposes, regardless of what subfaction bonuses you select. The appeal of Expert Crafters is that it optimizes damage output for small units dedicated to target elimination. So that means that if you're playing without crafters, you have to find other ways to achieve similar optimization for target elimination. And that will sometimes involve spending psychic resources or spending CP. And so you have to plan for that, right? The advantage to crafters is you don't have to spend psychic resources or CP in order to get those bonuses. But if you plan carefully for those expenditures and you use other buffs in place of crafters, you can do very well. I'm going to walk you through how to think about list design for a non-crafters roster, and then we'll dive in. And when we dive into those individual craft worlds, I'll not only talk about their individual strengths, that if you choose to play Iyanden, there's certain things you definitely want to take advantage of. I will also point out where it might be best not to try and capitalize on some of the unique bonuses that an individual craft world has access to. Some of their special advantages are actually huge traps, flavorful traps, narratively interesting traps, but traps nonetheless. Sorry, Prince Uriel, the space elves of Iyanden fight much better when you stay home. Okay. 9th edition 40k is all about scoring. It's not about killing. When I see new players at my local game store who we have a new local game store actually in my area. I've been enjoying working with some new players. But when I see players who played maybe back in 5th or 6th edition who've come to 9th edition for the first time, something that they have a really hard time getting their head around is the degree to which it is no longer about killing your opponent's army in the most efficient manner possible. There are some high-level competitive lists that really are about trying to table your opponent on turn 2, but the majority of the game is not about that. In 9th edition 40k, the single most important questions a player needs to answer when list building are, how will my army score primary objectives? And what secondary objectives will my army favor? How will it score those? I have made videos about both of these things. There are also articles on my website about these things. If you have not already watched my video on primary objective scoring and my video on secondary objective scoring, and you are trying to make a competitive Ulthwe list or whatever, it will not all be here. It is not all in this video. I strongly suggest you give those a careful watch. And so I'm not going to rehash for each of the craft worlds, our best options for holding objectives and our best options for, retrieve Octarius data or whatever. Because guess what, guys? It's warp spiders for retrieve Octarius data. It doesn't matter what craft world you're running. It's warp spiders. There are other units that you can use for it, but they certainly have a lot of place. So you already, I think, need a general handle on how Craftworld Eldar play primaries and secondaries. When I do go through the individual craft worlds, I will talk about special advantages an individual craft world may have with reference to how to do those things a little bit differently. But this video is going to assume a general knowledge of good craft worlds tactics for doing that. So you could, I suppose, pause this right now, go watch those, and then come back if you wanted to. All right. So useful principles for playing without custom craft world bonuses, including expert crafters. The first one is essentially you have to completely rethink target elimination. Most of the resources online about target elimination, about running craft worlds lists, is focused on MSU style play. So minimum sized units that hit extra hard because of the crafter's bonus, just maximizes those rerolls. So you're not going to be getting the same damage output bonus, say on your Shining Spears. If an MSU unit of Shining Spears with Hunters of Ancient Relics and Expert Crafters increases its damage output in melee by over 50%. With no psychic expenditure and no CP. You don't have that. So if you're going to run a conventional craft world, you need to think of other ways to buff the units in your army dedicated to target elimination. So not the ones that are primarily there to score primary and secondary objectives, the ones that are there for target elimination, which might only be 50% of your list, or maybe even less than that. That's okay. Again, I think new players can have a really difficult time when they're new to this edition getting their head around the degree to which your list does not need to be focused on target elimination. Now, target elimination in a non-crafter's list in some ways is a throwback to the early days of 8th edition, back when 9 elf units of Shining Spears and Dark Reapers were dominating tables. And most lists had at least one unit of 20 Guardians with 2 platforms lurking in Deep Strike. I think 9 is too many for Shining Spears and Dark Reapers, but larger units. The fact is that Craftworld Eldar rely on damage multipliers from psychic powers and stratagems to get fair value for their target elimination units. In fact, sometimes it seems in the current meta that competitive factions with updated codexes, they have units that are, their target elimination units tend to be, their good ones, tend to be about as good as ours when ours are fully buffed. And that's without our opponents necessarily spending CP. So you have to plan very carefully about how you are going to enhance your target elimination units to make them really worth their points and do their jobs effectively. Here are a bunch of units that work really well in a non-crafter's list. So I already mentioned Shining Spears. Large units of Shining Spears. I like 7. If you buff them with Empower, they now threaten units that are toughness 7 and 8, right? Most of the lances in that unit, you can give the Exarch the upgraded lance. Most of the lances in that unit are strength 6 when you charge. And so if you give them Empower, they're +1 to wound. Now they're wounding a T8 or even a T9 target. Is that even a thing? They're wounding T8 targets on a 4-up. They have a -4 AP. So that psychic buff makes them so that they're not just there now for taking out light tanks and heavy infantry. Now they're a serious threat to some of the toughest, in terms of a toughness value, units in the game. If you put Doom on the target, they will annihilate it. You can also cast Enhance on them, right? At that point, I think you have too many resources into one unit. That makes them hit on 2s. But if you have even a single unit of 7 Shining Spears, if you're ready to commit 2 or 3 psychic powers to making them vicious killers, they can destroy almost anything in the game. And I think when you're playing with a non-crafter's list, the way that you have to think is you always want to be able to pick an enemy unit on the board. Each turn 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you pick an enemy unit and you kill it. And it virtually doesn't matter what it is. There might be some exceptions. I don't know, Mortarion is not what he used to be in the current meta, but something like Mortarion may take you a couple of turns. But you should have buffs in place. You should have units that, when buffed, can destroy. And it doesn't have to be more than 1 or 2 units, but that's where you want to be. Large units of fire dragons that fire and fade into either a falcon or a wave serpent. And when they pop out, you buff them with guide. I have a whole video about fire dragons, how to play them. The unit focus video on fire dragons in no way requires you to have expert crafters or custom Craftworld traits. They have wonderful synergy in conventional Craftworld lists. Full-size unit of Warwalkers buffed with guide. Very powerful. They can fire and fade in your backfield. They can put serious damage on either infantry units or tanks, because the missiles have the 2 profiles and they're a blast unit. So, 6 missiles, each coming in with blast 6. That's a great way to clear out big units of Skitarii, Orc hordes. For Orc hordes, you may also want to doom the target. They've become very tough now, but Warwalkers have a lot of play. Even this is a super out of fashion idea. This is an idea that was cool 2 years ago. Honestly, 6 scatter lasers, if you cast Jinx on the target so that they are now hitting at -1, and you're prepared to doom a hard target, they're not good against stuff with really high armor, but it's a hard meta right now for tanks, and there's a lot of infantry in the game, and those scatter lasers have a 36-inch range. Firing and fading those Warwalkers, again, that's like a tactic from 2.5 years ago or something, and it can work for you with the right buffs. It can do okay. It also helps to have an Autarch nearby for your Warwalkers. In fact, if you check out my video on the backline Farseer, I also have an article on the website, the Soccer Mom of Space Elves. A lot of the information about running a backline Farseer as a way of buffing target elimination units, Night Spinners, Warwalkers with long-range weapons, even something like Reapers. A nearby Farseer can pop Runes of Witnessing, which is like mini Doom on multiple units, and you don't need to be near the target that you're dooming. So it's a 2-point stratagem, and it lets you reroll ones to wound. And if you have an Autarch nearby also, and you're rerolling ones to hit and rerolling ones to wound, and maybe you cast Guide on your best unit, you can have some backline artillery that is super vicious and in no way relies on expert crafters in order to function. A Lynx. I'd like to do a unit-focused video just on the Lynx. The Lynx is our Forge World tank. I think it comes in at 225 points. The real advantage to the Lynx is it's very durable. It has 16 wounds. It has a 5-up invuln. Most of our tanks don't have invulns. They badly need them. They don't. That's another thing I like about Warwalkers. A Lynx puts out 6 shots that do flat 3 damage and hit ridiculously hard. You need to buff it with Guide. You maybe need to buff it with Runes of Witnessing. But if you do, it can do some real work for you. A single 1 or 2 Wraithseers, no, not 1 or 2, excuse me, a single Wraithseer that casts on itself, it swaps out Smite for the Runes of whatever the new runes thing is. I'm having a dumb moment, but it's called Fateful Divergence. You swap out Smite for Fateful Divergence, and it's mini expert crafters. You get to reroll either one of your hit dice or one of your wound dice. So a Wraithseer with the shoulder-mounted D-Cannon, which is a 24-inch indirect fire weapon that hits super hard, that has access to that reroll, can do okay with its D-Cannon. And one of the nice things about having a single Wraithseer in your backfield, hiding out of line of sight, using his indirect fire, is that he protects those other artillery. Like, say you have a squad of Dark Reapers back there, and maybe you have a Lynx, or maybe you have 2 units of 3 Warwalkers and the Wraithseer. He's there to be a melee deterrent, because his D3 plus 3 4 attack ridiculous Wraithglaive in melee is super scary. So he can potentially both add to your artillery barrage and also protect those other units. Wraithblades. Wraithblades with ghost swords. So the ghost axes are obviously better for holding objectives, but Wraithblades with ghost swords, when you cast Enhance and Empower on them and have a nearby Spirit Seer, just sheer volume of attacks when they charge, they can do an obscene amount of damage to something. You have to get a little bit tricky. Maybe you jump them out of a Serpent, or you bring them in out of Deep Strike and you cast on them to give them a bonus to charge, and you have a reroll in your back pocket or something. But they are an option, right? Fire Prisms. The Fire Prisms used to be the very beginning of 8th edition. They got some play because if you have 3 Fire Prisms in your list, you have a lot of the advantages, a lot of the advantages that something like Expert Crafters gives you, and they also have access to pseudo indirect fire without having to spend psychic resources. I think Fire Prisms are a little bit overpriced for how hard they hit, but frankly, so is most of what we have. And there's a way to play them. So you need 3 in your list. That's very expensive. But the linked fire stratagem is when you pick a target with the first prism, and if the 2 other prisms target that, all the prisms get to reroll all of their hit dice, all of their wound dice, and all of the prisms can target something that only 1 prism can see. So the move is you put them all out of line of sight. One of them moves into line of sight of a thing. They all light it up, and then it fire and fades back out of line of sight. And they have 3 different profiles, so they can threaten anything on the board. There's no type of unit that they don't have a profile that is appropriate to. And so is it quite as optimal for target elimination as some of the crafters combos? No. Is it pretty damn good? Yes. And so you have a certain amount of points in your list dedicated to target elimination units they're just kitted out, and you've planned in your list construction to be getting your rerolls other ways. Craftworlds, we do rely on bonuses and rerolls. We need them. But there are other ways to get to them. As a conventional Craftworld player, you have plenty of options for making your units hit hard. Okay. Principle 2 of playing conventional Craftworlds. Some of the popular units that are out there online that everybody's talking about that are supposed to be great are super suboptimal without crafters. So you need to be really careful about where you get advice. Singleton Warwalkers is a big thing or was a big thing. It comes in and out of fashion as the meta changes with expert crafters. They're just not a great pick if you're not running expert crafters, because you want larger units that you can buff. Wraith Lords they were good for a hot minute, but now there's so much anti-tank in the game that they have a really tough time because they have a declining profile and an invuln save, and they kind of need to be in the line of fire. Those Wraith Seers are really only good if you use them in the way that I just talked about. So be wary, be thoughtful as you decide what units you're going to include. And you can't necessarily just get online and look at, what Eldar units are good at killing stuff and use that build, because many of those online builds, again, they're relying on this notion that you're willing to play with expert crafters. Okay. Principle number 3. You probably need more Psykers in your list than you would if you were playing with expert crafters for obvious reasons. Expert crafters is a damage multiplier, and Eldar rely on their Psykers to be damage multipliers when they're not doing it with that crutch that GW gave us for a few months until we get our codex. You might also need an Autarch. Without the inherent damage multipliers provided by crafters, psychic buffs are even more essential. If you're going to run 2 Farseers, which I think is really not a terrible idea, I would suggest having one frontline Farseer who has Doom, Executioner, and Smite. Maybe he flies around behind some Shining Spears that have Expert Rider. So the Exarch has a 3-up invuln. The Shining Spears are providing Lookout Sir cover to your forward Farseer. He could also travel with Wraith Blades, with axes. They're not as quick. He can't get around as well. And he's putting out, he's dooming units which is a massive damage multiplier, and then he's putting out potentially 3d3 mortal wounds a turn. You can cast Unparalleled Mastery, use the Unparalleled Mastery stratagem so he can cast 3 times. Then you have a backline Farseer who's casting Guide on a unit, an artillery unit, to make it effective at shooting. And then casting Fortune on something that you need to hold an objective, which probably is also getting Protect cast on it. For his 3rd power, I suggest Focus Will, or to make one of your other. So Focus Will gives another caster +2 to all of his casts, or you could give him Fateful Divergence, which is, again, it's mini expert crafters. If you wanted to have something like, I mentioned a Wraith Seer before. If the Wraith Seer is not casting on itself, that's something that you could do with your Farseer. But that backline Farseer gives you access to Runes of Witnessing, which I've already explained, and buffs that you badly need. So the foot Farseer in the back, maybe with Falchi's Wings so he can get around, and the Farseer Skyrunner in the front, that's a pretty powerful combo for Craftworlds. One of those elves, who's ever got the more important powers, probably actually the backline Farseer, arguably, needs to have a Warlock traveling with him so that they can make use of Seer Council. Oh, and this brings up another good point. If at all possible, if you're playing a conventional Craftworld, try to run a single battalion. You need those points. You need those CP badly, probably. You're going to burn through a lot of CP. So you could do a single battalion and a patrol detachment. That would be okay. It only costs you 2 points. But if you can make a single battalion work for you, it's probably worth doing. On the runes, the Warlock / Spirit Seer / Wraith Seer front, you definitely need Protect in your list. Something holding an objective is going to need Protect. And you may actually want 2 casters with access to Protect Jinx. So, and this is where a Wraith Seer could be super useful, because if you are running a single battalion, you only have 3 HQ slots. And if you were to run 2 Farseers and, say, a Warlock, so you could use Seer Council, in order to get another caster in the list, it would need to be a Wraith Seer. Wraith Seers don't take up an HQ slot. It's a heavy Forge World unit, but it has that extra psychic cast. If you are running an additional combat patrol on top and you can get the 2 more characters, it's worth considering possibly including an autarch. That does solve your caster problem. But your first 2 runes of battle picks really might want to be Protect, Jinx twice. You can also, I suppose, run a Warlock Conclave and they'll get 2 powers and you get something else. But Protect and Jinx, they're different powers, which you've all read the Codex, you know. And they're both fabulous. So the ability to jinx an enemy unit and protect one of your own, that only works if, unless you have a Warlock Conclave that has multiple casts, that only works if you have 2 Psykers that both have Protect Jinx. So definitely worth considering. Quicken, Empower, Enhance, also really good. In Conceal, in some lists, Conceal is worth considering. But you definitely need more psychic casts than you need in a list that has access to those custom Craftworld traits. So this is a thing to consider. Whatever you decide concerning psychic buffs, you should plan to be able to have at least 2 units massively defensively buffed. So I'm thinking like, imagine you've got a unit of Wraith Blades with Ghost Axes, and they've been buffed with Protect to have a 3-up invuln, and then maybe you have, and ideally they would also have Fortune for a Feel No Pain save. But if you have to split it, maybe elsewhere you have, on a backfield objective, say a unit of Storm Guardians with making use of Celestial Shield, and maybe they have Fortune on them, and the one that's likely to take more fire is going to pop lightning fast reactions, or you put that on one and you put Conceal on the other. So you have 2 units with an invulnerable save. One has a 3-up, the other one has a 4-up. At least one of them has a 5-up Feel No Pain, and one or both of them can be -1 to hit. That is the level of durability that you need to reliably hold objectives. So whatever you decide in terms of how you parcel out your psychic resources, don't overlook Fortune. It is essential. You also need Protect. You need to be prepared to super buff a couple of units to hold objectives. Whew. All right. So that's the end of the general introductory information. We need super buffed units to hold objectives. We need larger units benefiting from psychic or stratagem buffs for target elimination. We need to rethink the number of psychers that we put in our list, and we have to ignore some of the information online about what's good, because that information is presupposing that you're willing to play a custom craft world. At this point, I'm going to start talking about the advantages and disadvantages, mostly the advantages of each of the individual conventional craft worlds, and I'm going to start with Ulthwe. Craftworld Ulthwe might be the strongest of the conventional craft worlds in competitive play. It has access to powerful mortal wound spam. It has guardians that are genuinely worth having, unlike many of the craft world's troop choices. And it has a native durability bonus that is especially effective for multi-wound infantry and bikers. It also has the best named character available to Craftworld Eldar, and that is Eldred. So Eldred is the undisputed best HQ available to our faction. He's a Farseer who knows and can cast an extra runes of fate power in the psychic phase, and in addition, he gets +1 to psychic casts if the previous power he attempted succeeded in manifesting. As a result, he is both a reliable engine for essential unit buffs and potentially the backbone of some of the nastiest mortal wound spam in the game. If you use a nearby Warlock to buff Eldred with Focus Will after you pop the stratagem Seer Council, this celebrity space elf performs his first power at +3 and additional powers at +4 to the cast. And you remember, you can use the Unparalleled Mastery stratagem so that he can cast a 4th time. Eldred has with these bonuses, he has about a 50% chance of pulling off Super Smite for D6 damage. If you commit to a reroll, remember Farseers get a free reroll. If you just promise yourself that no matter what you roll, if you don't get Super Smite the first time, you're going to reroll it, you have a 75% chance of getting to the D6 super smite. Now, if you succeed the first time and you choose to roll again, could you fail? Yes. It's not very likely. If you are also using Executioner, he's putting out probably 75% of the time, he's putting out D3 plus D3 plus D6 mortal wounds per turn. That is vicious. And on top of that, he can cast Doom or either Fortune or Guide. And if you really want to make heads roll, you can have him team up with the Ynnari character Yvraine, who can be put into Craftworlds detachments. And she both has access to Smite and another Smite-like power. So, and she is a reliable caster. She has a bonus to her casts also. So that gives you another 2d3 mortal wounds. So Yvraine plus Eldred, that is a psychic wrecking ball. It's 4d3 plus d6 mortal wounds. It's completely vicious. To be fair, mortal wounds can be fickle. You could roll ones on all of those. But nevertheless, it's potentially an incredibly potent damage-dealing combo, and it will also scare the crap out of your opponent and enable you to dominate the midfield simply because the range on Smite will cause your opponent to think twice about certain plays. Now, Smite does, of course, have the disadvantage that it has to target the nearest unit, so there is an opportunity for an opponent to play around it, but nevertheless, it's a really powerful weapon. Eldred and his allies, in fact, I mentioned midfield play. Eldred generally wants to hover around a midfield objective, maybe not on it, just forward of your deployment zone, well screened by a unit with an invulnerable save that has been kicked up to a 3++ using Protect. The ideal candidate is Wraithblades with Ghost Axes. Another option is Asserman and a whole bunch of Dire Avengers. Even a large, honestly, if you really want to use that large foot conclave of Warlocks, if you're running an Ulthwe list, that's a move. They only have 2 wounds, not 3 wounds. I think the Wraithblades are a little better for this, but it's certainly thematic to use the Warlock Conclave. And you need for him to be well screened by a unit with access to a kick-ass Feel No Pain. Now, the reason I say just in front of your deployment zone and just behind an objective is the unit screening for him needs to be holding the objective, because you only have a couple of opportunities to buff something to 3++, and so the unit screening Eldred also has to be one of your objective holders. If you are trying to play the secondary Warp Ritual, which works okay for Ulthwe, that's obvious. It's not going to be Eldred who does that because you don't want to give up your casts, but potentially if there is an objective close to the center of the board, it is worth considering Warp Ritual as a option, because you're going to have the opportunity probably to dominate that portion of the board anyway. And if Eldred gets killed and his whole escort gets killed and all of your units trying to dominate the midfield get killed, well, you're going to lose the game anyway. So at that point, not pulling off Warp Ritual. I mentioned in my last video the concept of a lose more include. Win more includes are bad, right? A unit that only ever works well for you when you were going to win the game anyway. Lose more includes, fantastic. A unit that is super badass, it's great. It makes the difference in a lot of games, and the only games it doesn't make the difference in are the games that you couldn't have won anyway. So because including Eldred in your list means you probably want to dominate some portion of the midfield, if there happens to be an objective close enough to the center of the table that you can control that space while controlling the midfield objective that you need and doing the thing that you need Eldred to do, Warp Ritual can be a reasonably good play. Also, you have casters with enough bonuses. You have access to enough bonuses that maybe your opponent's and enough psychic brutality that your opponent's chance of being able to deny Warp Ritual either won't be great, or in order to decide to deny Warp Ritual, your opponent will have to give up on trying to prevent one of your really important psychic powers from going off elsewhere. So that can be its own kind of win also. But regardless of where you position him, Eldred will distribute buffs, debuffs, and mortal wounds with regal savagery. His only downside is that he can't take a jet bike and he can't have Falchu's wing, so he's kind of slow. But it's not a big handicap. He has the same toughness and wounds as a Farseer Skyrunner, and he has a 3++ invuln instead of a 4++ invuln. So all of the durability bonuses that the Farseer Skyrunner has access to, he has those and more anyway. So you're losing the mobility. Not that big a deal. He's pretty quick. You make an advanced move with him on turn 1. You probably get where you need to get. All right, second big Ulthwe advantage that it makes sense to lean into, Foresight of the Damned. Foresight of the Damned is that rule that provides a 6+ feel no pain save to all your Ulthwe models. Although it's not as potent as some of the custom Craftworld combos, defensively, it's nevertheless a super solid faction bonus, and it's especially useful for multi-wound models like Wraith Infantry, Shining Spears, and Warlock Conclaves, because it creates a significant inefficiency in the flat 2 and flat 3 damage weapons used to target these units. For example, if one of your 3-wound Wraith Blades fails an armor save against a weapon that does flat 3 damage, you then roll 3d6s for your Foresight of the Damned. If you roll any 6s, the model survives the 3-wound hit. So mathematically, what this means is that your Wraith Infantry can shrug off 50% of incoming damage from weapons that do flat 3 damage. So you make the weapons that should be the most efficient for eliminating Wraith Blades exactly half as efficient as they otherwise would be. Your vehicles also will be noticeably more durable and are likely to require an extra hit from a hard-hitting heavy weapon to eliminate. So if you're going to run Ulthwe, I think it's a missed opportunity not to include some Wraith Blades in your list. All right, third and final big advantage to Ulthwe. It's the least of them, but it's not to be overlooked. It's good. The special Ulthwe stratagem, Discipline of the Black Guardians. It's a 1 CP stratagem that turns a unit of Guardians into an absolute murder machine. It gives them +1 to hit until the end of the phase. So there's a combo here that works really well. You take 20 Guardians, and you put them into Deep Strike, and maybe you give them some heavy weapons platforms. And if when you bring them in from Deep Strike, you position an Autarch Skyrunner or the Autarch with Swooping Hawk Wings close enough for them to benefit, you have 40 shuriken shots just from the Guardians, hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s. If you cast Doom on the target, this is where the math gets cool. Even something that's toughness 7 will take, which is most tanks, which will take an average of 21 wounds, 50% of which will be at -3 AP because of all the rerolls to wound. And suddenly, your humble Guardian Blob is a true all-purpose elimination unit. And this is without adding the heavy weapons platforms for more mayhem. And I like star cannons here because if you're dooming the target, you want the rate of fire of the star cannons, not the high strength of the Bright Lance. This is a super powerful combo, and you can do it even without the Autarch. It's just if you're casting Doom, having the Autarch there too really kicks it up a notch to be able to hit with 2s and reroll all those 1s. A word of caution. Some of you might be thinking to yourself, you know what I'll do? I'll have the Black Guardians be Eldred's escort, and it will be so narratively cool. He'll have all of these shadowy, skull-faced Guardians from Ulthwe who are known to be hardcore walking in front of him menacingly like mini Darth Vaders with their shuriken catapults. And I'll just cast Celestial Shield on them and protect, and they'll have a 3-up invuln. You didn't think of that, did you, Brent? Well, Ulthwe player, I say to you. No, I did think of it, and it is cool. It's a cool idea. The problem is that the 12-inch range on the shuriken catapults, you can use Guardians as an escort unit when you're running a custom Craftworld because you can make those you can give those catapults a 16-inch range and -1 AP if you choose the right buffs. But at 12 inches, the shuriken catapults, they can't hit anything. And in order for them to be able to target anything, you need to be close enough for your opponent to charge you, which is exactly the counter to Guardians because Celestial Shield doesn't work in melee. In melee, Guardians evaporate like soft cheese left out under a hole in the ozone. I don't know. They just melt. It's awful. So that combo, it looks tempting. It's not good. Asserman with a bunch of Dire Avengers, they have their 3-up invuln even in melee. But the fact that Celestial Shield doesn't work in melee and they have super short range weapons, total deal breaker. Instead, spend a CP, deep strike them, screen Eldred with something else, set it up. And when you do bring them in out of deep strike, be mindful of where your opponent's melee threats are, because if you want to be able to use them, do use Celestial Shield. But if you want access to them for more than a turn, you need to be sure that there's nothing super hard hitting that can reach them in melee, because that's the end of them. All right. I'll talk about two more marginal Ulthwe options. Their special relic, the special Ghost Helm, it's an Ulthwe only relic that gives the Psyker +1 to psychic test specifically for Smite. You could give it to a second Farseer who's not Eldred, I guess. But your second Farseer is, if you have one, is probably a backline Farseer. I don't know. Do you really need a second Farseer if you have Eldred? You could give it to a Spirit Seer who's running with those Wraith Blades that are screening him and giving those Wraith Blades, letting them reroll 1s in melee. That could be pretty cool. But your Spirit Seer maybe wants to cast Protect on the Wraith Blades. The only reason that this is even worth considering is that Craftworld Eldar don't have a lot of competitive relic options, and normally what you would give to a Foot Farseer like Eldred is Falchi's Wing, but he can't take it because he's a named character. So the Ghost Helm is kind of an awkward fit, and you might be better off just leaving it out and giving, I don't know, a Phoenix Gem or something to some Warlock Skyrunner. And frankly, the notion that you're going to give the Ghost Helm to the Spirit Seer and make the Mortal Wound spam, if your thing is Mortal Wound spam, Yvrain is a better pick anyway than a second Farseer. And your Spirit Seer can't make use of Seer Council. So your Warlocks can only have Baby Smite. So really, the relic would only be useful if it stood a really good chance of getting somebody who was going to do a D3 Smite to a D6 Smite instead, and the odds of that happening even once per game are not super high. So I think unless you have nothing else, no other good relic option in your list, you probably take a pass on this one. The last one, the Ulthwe Warlord trait, Fate Reader. It allows you to roll a d6 at the beginning of each player's turn, and you get a CP on a roll of a 6. On an average, this is worth 1 CP by the end of turn 3, and maybe one more before the game is over. In theory, it works out about as well as Seer of the Shifting Vector if you assume that on average you would spend about as many CP re-rolling for Protect Jinx as you would get from Fate Reader. The difference, of course, is that if you take Seer, you could also use the CP for an extra reroll in the Psychic phase if you needed to, or you could reroll an Invulnerable save. Seer of the Shifting Vector is just more flexible and is likely to save you as much CP. I think you're probably better off just sticking with that one. So that's my Ulthwe advice. You definitely need Eldred. Ulthwe is a subfaction that leans into controlling the midfield with Psychic Brutality and a large, well-buffed escort for your core Psychers. Your Wraithblade infantry is more durable for the reasons that I laid out, and you want to lean into that. And you probably do want to take one of those units of Black Guardians, stick them in Deep Strike, and use them for target elimination. And then you just have to plan your primary and secondary objective scoring like you would with any other list. All right. We'll talk Saim-Hann. I just said Saim-Hann. Saim-Hann, excuse me. I know GW has been officially asked if it isn't supposed to be Samhain, like the pagan holiday, which they seem to be named for. It's nope, Saim-Hann, for those newer players who are wondering. Okay, Saim-Hann, solid Craftworld pick. They have some, they have access to a couple of advantages that are the envy even of custom Craftworld lists, and they especially offer some potent options for melee-oriented target elimination, and we've established that target elimination is where custom Craftworlds struggle a little bit more. So in theory, this is definitely one of the stronger conventional Craftworlds. The Saim-Hann faction bonus is called Wild Host, and it allows all units to reroll all failed charges, and for biker units to treat heavy weapons as assault weapons when they advance. The first of these is particularly strong as it significantly increases the odds of pulling off a turn 1 charge with multiple units of Shining Spears, or even a large Warlock Conclave. A less obvious beneficiary is a unit of Wraithblades with Ghost Swords coming out of Deep Strike and enhanced with the Runes of Fortune power Ghost Walk, which bestows a +2 to charge. 6 Wraithblades with Ghost Swords put out 24 attacks on the charge at Strength 6, -3 AP, which is enough to annihilate most targets that don't have an invuln save. And if you cast Doom on anything above Toughness 6, they are monstrously good against anything, literally anything in the game without an invulnerable save. And I know that, I say Saim-Hann, you don't necessarily think, ooh, Wraithblades with Ghost Swords, but the math is simple. You need a 9-inch charge out of Deep Strike. With +2, you need a 7. 7 is the average roll on 2d6, and so if you can re-roll it, you'll succeed on that charge more than 75% of the time. That's pretty good. Now, as for the Shining Spears, I'm not into the turn 1 Shining Spear Blitz. I know there are plenty of good players who use it well. I don't know if it's my meta or my play style, but I prefer to set up surgical strikes against key units by playing the spears conservatively on the first turn, and then using Deep Strikers to perform charges with Ghost Walk, both on turns 2 and 3, so you could Deep Strike your Shining Spears, cast Ghost Walk on them, and you could, even if you wanted, swap in that Exarch power that gives them a charge bonus, and the ability to then re-roll those charges. Your spears become very efficient, reliable chargers out of Deep Strike. You can have a single unit of spears advance and charge somewhere if it needs to. Your Shining Spear, as well they should be, your Shining Spears are faster, more maneuverable, and in that sense more reliable. It is a blow not to have access to the extra attacks, right? The typical spear build right now is small units of spears target enemies on objectives with Hunters of Ancient Relics to increase their damage output by 50%. So when you're running your Saim-Hann spears, what I suggest is every turn you're hitting something with a unit of spears, and either the thing that's getting hit is getting debuffed with Doom, or more probably, the spears are getting buffed with Empower or Enhance, and that will make them more. So then they have the speed, the maneuverability, and the reliability and the charges of the Saim-Hann spears as they should, but then potentially with those buffs, they have a similar threat level to the Hunters of Ancient Relic spears, and ideally you want both. Another option is to run them alongside an Autarch Skyrunner. I think that he lets them reroll ones to hit, and he himself is pretty scary. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how to play him, though. So I'm going to leave that. I'm going to leave that for now. If you're really keen on running Banshees, the ability to reroll your charges, again, why wouldn't you just? The only real reason I think in a Saim-Hann list to take any Banshees is that you have run out of space in your detachments. You've used up all of your fast attack slots already. Maybe you stick a unit of Banshees in for some sort of extra. If you're trying to overwhelm your opponent early in the game by tying lots of units up in melee on turn 1, Banshees can be effective for that. But they're not likely to live very long, and the amount of additional points you have to pay to get 3 spears instead of 5 Banshees are such that I think you only do that if you're already maxed out on fast attack slots in your detachments. If, however, you can totally overwhelm your opponent on turn 2, so on turn 1 you set up, all of these Shining Spear, your 3 Shining Spear units and a couple of Banshee units, and maybe you have some Wraithblades coming in out of Deep Strike, and you hit your opponent from multiple angles on turn 2, and you tie up 50% of your opponent's army in pretty effective melee, you might actually win the game right there. That's a very Harlequins move. There's a way to play Harlequins where you set up for this, essentially a turn 2 board wipe, where you blow all of your CP, you just hit your opponent devastatingly hard in melee, and you try to not kill his whole army, but cripple your opponent so badly that at that point it's not possible to win the game. And that is one one way to play Saim-Hann. It's probably not going to win major tournaments. Well, not a lot of Eldar lists no Eldar lists are winning any major tournaments right now, but it might not win a tournament at your local store, but it probably would do very well for you in semi-competitive play with a pretty skilled player. The Saim-Hann bonus to biker units is also especially good for Vipers because they can make an advance move on turn 1 to score engage on all fronts, and now they can do that while having star cannons instead of shuriken catapults and still shoot. They can do some real damage then to heavy infantry or light tanks. I think it can be difficult. This is only going to happen though if you're running multiple detachments, because you definitely want 3 units. You need to max out your Shining Spears if you're running Saim-Hann, I think. So you might have some trouble fitting them into the list, but if you are running if you are running 2 detachments and your second detachment is a fast attack detachment, you can have a whole bunch of extra units. You may have room for a couple of singleton Vipers that will help you score engage on turns 1 and 2, and maybe while your opponent is trying to deal with other things in the list, your Vipers with their star cannons will just get ignored. That can be pretty good. Okay. Hornets. The Forge World unit. Hornets are also a pretty good option for Saim-Hann. They like having expert crafters for the reroll, but if you do have a unit of 3 Hornets that you can afford to cast Guide on, they can do some work for you too. Okay, Warriors of the Raging Winds. This is a 1 CP stratagem. It's the Saim-Hann biker stratagem that allows a unit to advance and charge and to reroll 1s to hit in the fight phase. It's freaking fantastic. Obviously, the most obvious recipient of this is a unit of Shining Spears. And so if you are trying to zip across the table with one on turn 1, you do this turn 1, 2, 3. You should be using it multiple turns of the game. You should have multiple units of Shining Spears to use this on. It can also be used on an Autarch Skyrunner or a Warlock Conclave. The Warlock Conclave is often overlooked as an option for Saim-Hann, but it is powerful because, like Spears, a Conclave continues to benefit. Unlike Spears, a Conclave continues to benefit from invulnerable saves in melee. So if you want something that's going to slam into your opponent in melee, do some damage, and then be really sticky, unlike your Spears, that doesn't have to come out of Deep Strike. Conclaves are expensive, but I have a whole video about how to play Conclaves. And if you are using a Conclave and a Saim-Hann list, you probably don't want to do exactly what I suggested in that video. But in theory, a Saim-Hann player could make a turn 1 blitz with a 9 elf Conclave unit that's rolling, 18 dice, hitting on 3s, rerolling 1s, wounding everything on 2s because that's how their Witchblades work. Rerolling 1s because of the stratagem, right, that we're talking about, Warriors of the Raging Winds. And then if you jinx the target, you've got -1 AP. You need to jinx the target because the Witchblades don't jinx. And you're doing D3 damage per hit. If you cast Protect on them, now they have a 3-up invuln. If you cast Fortune on them, now they have a 5-up Feel No Pain. And now you have 27 wounds worth of bikers with a 3+ invuln and a 5++ Feel No Pain, maybe more or less in your opponent's backfield. That is a monstrous problem that your opponent needs to deal significant resources to dealing with, and it will free your other units up to maneuver unmolested. It's nasty. I'm not saying you should do it because it's super points intensive, but if you are a Saim-Hann player and you haven't taken a serious look at Warlock Conclaves, you might want to do that. Okay. The Relic, also super good. The Nova Lance of Saim-Hann. This Relic Lance can only be given to an Autarch Skyrunner. It's just like a Laser Lance, except that it's strength 8 when the Autarch charges, and it wounds on wound rolls of a 6+, it does 4 damage instead of 2 damage. That is fabulous. The Nova Lance totally transforms what you can expect of your Autarch, because normally the Autarch can't get the upgraded Lance that Shining Spear Exarch has access to, so your Autarch is sort of stuck at strength 6. But the Nova Lance, that strength 8 with the double damage, that's incredible. Not only does your flying War Chief now pose a serious threat to toughness 8 targets that don't have invulnerable saves, but she also has potential as a character assassin. if you give her Seer of the Shifting Vector as a warlord trait, she can re-roll a wound roll, which effectively increases her attack characteristic to 5 and gives you a decent chance of rolling at least 1/6 to wound. It's very probable. And if you were to doom the target, so she's re-rolling the failed wounds, against a doomed target, at least flat 8 damage is statistically very likely, and she goes straight through any armor that's not an invuln. And if you also use Warriors of the Raging Wind, well, now she's advancing, charging, hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s. It's incredible. Think the Novalance Autarch, you need to think of her as a slim torpedo to be unloaded on one of your opponent's most dangerous units at a critical moment. It can swing the whole game in your favor if you, for example, kill an essential character or some other hard-to-reach target. Lastly, Wild Rider Chieftain. This is the warlord trait for Saim-Hann. It enables the recipient to make pile-in moves towards the nearest enemy character rather than the nearest enemy unit, and it confers an extra attack against an enemy character in the fight phase. Do not bother with this. Don't do it. It's a trap. If you want to use a warlord trait to enhance your Autarch Skyrunner, you are much better off just taking Seer of the Shifting Vector, which provides a reroll equivalent to an extra attack and can alternatively allow you to do some other thing if you need to do other things instead. Do that. Anyway, so Saim-Hann, pretty good if you're interested in a jet bike oriented build that will be supported by Wraithblades coming out of Deep Strike, maybe get some Warlock Conclaves going and try to just overwhelm your opponent in melee on turn 2, or deliver just one brutal cavalry charge after another each turn of the game, while your other units, the ones that I haven't talked about, that are dedicated to scoring secondary and primary objectives, just quietly do their work. I think you can do really well as a Saim-Hann player, even though it's hard to play conventional Craftworlds right now. Biel-Tan, the Swordwind. Oh, I love the fluff for these guys. I like the fluff for everybody, quite honestly. One of the reasons I play Space Elves because I love Space Elves, but I love the notion of sociopathic, psychopathic Space Elves who are trying to restore some notion of a fallen empire and have completely lost all sight of anything reasonable in terms of benevolence, compassion, or consideration of others. Let's be clear. If there's a conventional craft world who are definitely villains, we often say that nobody's good in the 40k universe except for Tau, and they're all nerds. But honestly, you're playing 40k. You were not cool in middle school. Neither was I. Biel-Tan are definitely the bad guys, but there's just something about them. Maybe it goes all the way back to Gav Thorpe when he had a weird ponytail in 1999 and was always running his Biel-Tan Space Elves and White Dwarf. Maybe that's what sold me on them. But I have a soft spot in my heart for the Swordwind. So these guys, their faction bonus is stupid. They have some great options, but the faction bonus provides a +1 leadership modifier to Aspect Warriors, which makes sense. Their whole thing is supposed to be Aspect Warriors. They're supposed to have an above average number of Aspect Warriors, and it allows models armed with shuriken weapons to reroll 1s to hit. This is dumb. From a lore perspective, it's completely bizarre, because what it does is it encourages Biel-Tan players to lean into Guardians and Wind Riders, despite the fact that their whole thing is supposed to be their Aspect Warriors. Yes, it benefits the Dire Avengers too, but come on, let Aspect Warriors reroll. I just do not, from a game design perspective, this makes absolutely no sense to me at all. And in fact, also on the table, I think it's best not to build your list around trying to maximize the Swordwind bonus. I think that is the biggest way that Biel-Tan players go wrong. That leadership bump we just mentioned, that can be useful for a large squad of Shining Spears, or if you have Fire Dragons jumping out of a transport, it can work for them, but it is hardly a game changer. The reroll for shuriken weapons is nice, but it just isn't good enough to merit trying to capitalize on it with multiple Guardian blobs or large Wind Rider units. And frankly, if what you want your thing to be a Shuriken Fire, you should be playing a custom Craftworld anyway. There are multiple custom Craftworld traits just for that. The single biggest trap Biel-Tan players fall into, I think, is to take a pass on really effective target elimination units, the kind that I talked about in the early part of this video, in order to make room for multiple big Guardian blobs. Unlike Discipline of the Black Guardians, Swordwind has no synergy with an Autarch, because an Autarch just does the same thing for them. It doesn't affect their heavy weapons platforms, and there are just, even with that bonus, there are just better target elimination units available for the points. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to have the rerolls, but honestly, they're doing more work for you on your Shining Spears with their Shuriken Catapults, and maybe if you have a couple of MSU Wind Rider units to help you score and engage on all fronts anyway, you could have a single deep striking Guardian Blob, I guess, but really, do not make Swordwind the cornerstone of your list building strategy. If you are running a 10 Elf Dire Avenger squad and you have Asserman in the list, so this is where I think it really does work for you. So if you have Asserman in the list and you're running to give a 4-up invuln to 10 Dire Avengers, and you are going to cast Protect on them to make it a 3-up invuln, and Fortune on them to give a 5-up Feel No Pain, so you can dominate a midfield objective. And I think this is a great move with Biel-Tan. And you give them Avenging Strike. Well, now that Swordwind power, that's great. So what Avenging Strike does is it gives you +1 to hit and +1 to wound. So you even something that's like toughness 7, they're wounding on a 4. And when they save on 3s and have a 5-up Feel No Pain, it's really hard to kill them. They're on a midfield objective. Your opponent can't ignore them. They have to target them, but they won't be able to kill them all in a turn. And so then you have like 7 Space Elves that, because of the bonus for Biel-Tan, are rerolling 1s, but they're hitting on 2s with Avenging Strike, and they're wounding pretty much everything on 2s, 3s, or 4s. That's great, right? But don't build your list around it. Just enjoy the fact that other units that have jobs to do anyway. So that Asserman combo, that if you watch my unit on primary objective control, that's one of the things that I suggest. So you have these other units in your list anyway that benefit from it, and it's good to acknowledge the benefit, but don't try to build your list around it. 2, okay. Natural Leader. The Biel-Tan Warlord trait is freaking fantastic. I actually think it's the best Warlord trait in the Codex, and nobody talks about it. It allows you to designate a unit within 3 inches of your Warlord at the beginning of the shooting phase and reroll all failed hit rolls for that unit. So it's Guide, but it's better because it doesn't require a Psychic cast and it can't be denied. And then you can cast Guide on something else. So if you have a backfield Farseer who's also your Warlord, he could Guide one unit and he could Natural Leader another unit. And so maybe you have, like, I don't know, something with indirect fire, like a Night Spinner, and then nearby you have 3 Warwalkers that are popping out and fire and fading into cover. You can have Guide on both of those, essentially. That's really, really good. If you also have a frontline Farseer out there that's like dooming and jinxing the targets for this backline artillery, well, now your Biel-Tan list has target elimination that can hold its head up high next to expert crafters. It's a great combo. Honestly, I think that Warlord trait alone is enough to make. You don't have to. Biel-Tan is not. It's not one of the strongest traditional Craftworlds, but that's really good. Okay, the Relic, the Spirit Stone, and the Burnished Blade. So the first of these 2 relics gives one of your Psychers a casting reroll, and the second one is just a power sword that does 2 damage. You could take the Spirit Stone and give it to your Warlock with Protect Jinx. That's really good. It has good synergy with Natural Leader also. If you forego Seer of the Shifting Vector to take Natural Leader, the Spirit Stone will make up for the casting reroll you lost by not having Seer of the Shifting Vector. So it's a totally kick-ass combination in a Biel-Tan list to both have access to something that gives you what you would have used Seer of the Shifting Vector for, and also an even better Warlord trait. The Burnished Blade, I guess you'd give it to an Autarch. Don't. Your Autarchs are not frontline melee units. Your Autarchs with swooping hawk wings. Court of the Young King. Okay, this is a 2 CP stratagem that gives a unit of Aspect Warriors +2 to charge and enables them to reroll 1s to hit in the fight phase. The best target for this is your Shining Spears, probably when they're attacking out of Deep Strike, because you bring them in, you cast Ghost Walk on them, and you use Court of the Young King, and in theory you could also give them an Exarch trait, and then they would be at +5 to charge. +4 is probably enough for you, and you can choose a different Exarch trait. It's really good, and being able to reroll 1s to hit in the fight phase is fabulous. So if you're going to run Biel-Tan, do this. Now, there's an additional aspect to this stratagem that is tempting and I think problematic. So if the charging unit also happens to be within 6 inches of the Avatar of Cain, the charge bonus becomes +3. Now, let's be clear. This is not a reason to include the Avatar of Cain in your list. There's a way to run the Avatar of Cain really effectively in competitive play. It works best when you have, sorry guys, Expert Crafters and Hunters of Ancient Relics, because it significantly improves its damage output, and it does not have damage output appropriate to its cost. But if you are going to run the Avatar of Cain, you need to have a lot of CP for the Avatar Resurgence, so you can keep bringing it back in melee. There's a whole way you have to build around that. I have a video about running the Avatar of Cain. I think that trying to cram the Avatar of Cain into your Biel-Tan list because you want the narrative satisfaction of Court of the Young King is exactly that. It's a narrative play. It's an emotional play. And full disclosure, I've done it. I love narrative games. I like building lists around a story. But if what you're trying to do is make the most competitive Biel-Tan list that you can, the Avatar is probably not the move. But Court of the Young King is great on your Shining Spears. You have a killer Warlord trait / relic combo available to you. You probably have the best Warlord trait in the game. And Swordwind, even though it has a lot of problems, is still going to enhance a bunch of units that you want in your list anyway. And I think that if you take advantage of all of the stuff that Biel-Tan has to offer, it really is pretty good, right? So, and you have a lot of flexibility. Like Biel-Tan, Saim-Hann wants you to lean into a particular kind of build. There's a lot of flexibility with what a Biel-Tan list can look like and play well. Craftworld Alaitoc. These darlings of the 8th edition table definitely aren't quite what they were, but they're still better than the internet thinks that they are. Craftworld Alaitoc has the most inherently durable units at long range, and it is the only Eldar subfaction for which Rangers still have really significant play instead of maybe a one-off to fill a troop slot and grab an objective. The subfaction bonus is called Fieldcraft. Attacks that target an Alaitoc model more than 12 inches away must subtract 1 from the hit roll. Back in early 8th edition, Fieldcraft made Craftworld Alaitoc the terror of many a tournament table, especially flyers, because they come with a -1 hit penalty, so they were up to -2 before you cast Conceal on them or used Lightning Fast. They could be made literally unhittable. But now that hit penalties cap out at -1, there's a greater emphasis on midboard, and there's a greater emphasis on midboard objective control. Alaitoc loyalists have to seriously rethink how they make use of this bonus. It is, however, still really good. The most obvious beneficiaries of Fieldcraft are long-range, heavy support units that don't want to be anywhere near the enemy. This includes Warwalkers with long-range weapons like Eldari missile launchers, or frankly even Bright Lances or Star Cannons. more or less anything at all that isn't a shuriken cannon. Dark Reapers, Fire Prisms, Lynxes, all of which are more durable with access to Fieldcraft. Even units that typically rely on Fire and Fade, like if you have Dark Reapers who are not taking the Tempest Launcher, or maybe a unit of Warwalkers, they still benefit from Fieldcraft because there are more indirect fire weapons in the game. So just being able to move them out of line of sight is not always going to be enough. The other big winners, I think especially for Dark Reapers here, Dark Reapers really, they're very vulnerable to indirect fire, and so that -1 to hit really makes a big difference. The other big winners here are objective holders in the very early game, right? Maybe on turn 1. So if they're taking midfield objectives, but objective holders who are likely in early turns anyway to take fire from units at long range become much more durable, and Alaitoc players don't have to worry about spending CP on lightning fast reactions early in the game. Now, later in the game, you still might use lightning fast if you have an enemy unit within 12 inches of you, but that additional durability, CP-free durability that's army-wide on the first turn for your objective holders really, really matters. The key, I think, to making the best use of Fieldcraft is not to be overly ambitious about its benefits. You still need to use Fire and Fade, Protect, and Fortune in order to keep fragile units alive and to control objectives. It's just your units get to be a little bit more durable. Okay, the Alaitoc specific stratagem is called Pathfinders. It's a 1 CP stratagem that renders a unit of Alaitoc Rangers that is in cover extra sneaky. They can now only be hit on natural 6s in the shooting phase. That sounds amazing. Unfortunately, Pathfinders is not quite as swanky as it initially appears, because 9th edition rules discourage players from placing objective markers on terrain, so the opportunity to use nigh unshootable elf ninjas as objective holders will not present itself in the majority of your games. Most of the time, your Alaitoc Rangers will not be able to hold an objective while also making use of Pathfinders, and that is a big disappointment. Nevertheless, it's still totally worth including at least a single unit of Rangers in an Alaitoc list if you plan to play Engage on All Fronts or Retrieve Octaria's Data. Because those powers, they do a CP-free Deep Strike, and then those powers, there's going to be enough terrain on the board that there's somewhere probably that you can put your Rangers where they can perform an action or help with Engage and get that huge durability bonus. Also, as an Alaitoc player, there might be matchups in which it makes serious sense for you to consider something like Behind Enemy Lines, where if you have 2 units in your enemy's deployment zone, you're scoring 4 points per turn. If you're playing against an opponent who has a very forward army, something that wants to rush the midfield and is going to have a thinly defended backfield, this might be a really good opportunity to lodge a 65-point unit in a terrain piece and make it virtually impossible to kill without your opponent turning around and marching units back to her own backfield, which probably is not how her list wants to play, right? If that is a melee list that relies on dominating the midfield, then this is a way to really foul your opponent up. So those Alaitoc Rangers, even though they don't have the objective holding chutzpah that we would like them to have, nevertheless, they can really be a thorn in your opponent's side. The Alaitoc Warlord trait, Puritanical Leader, allows units within 6 inches of your Warlord to automatically pass morale tests. Generally not worth it. You're probably better off just taking Seer of the Shifting Vector for rerolls on psychic tests and using Insane Bravery if you ever really need a unit to be insanely brave. If, however, you are using, say, multiple large units, like you're going to spread out and control the midfield with, 10 Wraith Blades, and you're running Asserman with 10 Dire Avengers, or you have some very specific kind of build where you have several large units spread out that could theoretically all be within 6 inches of a Warlord, it might be worth considering. But I think it is, unless you've really planned a particular kind of list that takes advantage of this, I think it's a very marginal choice indeed. The Alaitoc specific relic is the Shift Shroud of Alaitoc, which I might even be pronouncing correctly. This relic makes an infantry character -1 to hit in the shooting phase and allows her to deep strike without sending CP. Now, in general, Craftworld characters rely on keeping their heads down and their friends close in order to stay alive. So hopefully that -1 isn't coming up a whole lot for you. And as for the deep strike ability, it's a little hard initially to see the merits. You could always give it to a Farseer or a Warlock on foot and get them into position to use Doom or Jinx on turn 2. But it seems like you could also just put them on a bike and probably not need the deep strike power to get within range for those powers. Also, you would have to give up the ability to cast with them on turn 1, and so that's probably not a great use. You could give it to an Autarch, but why would you bother when an Autarch with Swooping Hawk Wings can already do the same thing? You're probably better off with either Falchi's Wing or the Phoenix Gem. I think there is one, however, potential use for this power. If you are playing if you're playing Pierce the Veil. So Pierce the Veil is a psychic secondary that needs to be performed within 6 inches of your opponent's battlefield edge and can rack up some serious points. It's very hard to do in 2,000 point play unless your opponent has a very elite army that needs to play for the midfield. Against something like Custodes that might have a tough time controlling its own backfield, this might work really well. So you give the Shift Shroud to, say, a Warlock on a bike, or not even, deep strike it on turn 2, basically into your opponent's backfield, completely out of line of sight. And if your opponent is able to get a bead on this unit, well, it's -1 to hit. That helps. Incidentally, I mentioned in my last video that Pierce the Veil does have really good synergy with behind enemy lines. I think this is a really strong move at 500 point play. I think it's a very situational move in 2,000 point games. But in certain matchups, it really might work for you. The problem is that, unlike in the old days, you do have to pick the relic that you're taking before you get to the table. So you would have to commit to this not knowing if there would necessarily be opportunity. So essentially, I think it's a great relic in 500 point games, and I think that you could use it in 2,000 point games successfully, but I think it's a little bit, it would be a risky include if we had good relics that it was taking the place of. If you don't really need Falchi's Wing, you're not running a Foot Farseer, and the Phoenix Gem is just kind of an afterthought, then, by all means, give it to a Warlock and have Pierce the Veil in your back pocket. Illic Night Spear. Okay, so Illic Night Spear is a sniper HQ, and he has a relic rifle called the Void Bringer. It's heavy 1, strength 4, -3 AP, flat 3 damage, and it automatically wounds non-vehicles on a 2+, which mitigates that strength 4, and it inflicts an additional mortal wound on rolls of 6. Obviously, also, this Space Elf Assassin hits on 2s, ignores the Lookout Sir rule when he's targeting enemies, and has a CP-free deep strike. At only 70 points, Illic is better than the internet thinks he is. Against armies that rely on buffs from characters with a wound profile of 3 or less and no invulnerable save, which isn't a whole lot of them to be fair, having a reliable assassin can be a total game changer. The problem is that most of the lists that you are likely to encounter in tournament play probably won't offer enough potential victims to optimize his presence. Nevertheless, even against these lists, Alaitoc's most famous Deadeye can usually inflict damage equal to his points by popping a few Eradicators or Cataphrons or whatever. The real question is whether you would rather just have another Warwalker or a Spirit Seer or a 2-elf Warlock Conclave. He's really, for his points, he's really not terrible. But you could, the problem is that there's some other things that you could spend those points on that are maybe arguably a bit more reliable. And honestly, 3 Shining Spears on bikes, that's a great character assassination unit, and it's 35 more points, and it can do a bunch of other stuff too. So you have to think critically about whether or not this is the move. But he does have pretty good synergy with those Alaitoc Rangers. So in theory, here's a thing that you could do. You could take a unit of 5 to 8 Alaitoc Rangers, put them into Deep Strike, put Illic into Deep Strike with them. If you need Octaria's data and engage on all fronts, on turn 2, you bring them in cover, sort of deep in some quadrant of the board that your opponent doesn't really want to be in, but with line of sight on key characters. And if Illic and the Rangers all target the same character the turn that they come in, you do stand a decent chance of putting some mortal wounds on that character. The Rangers do additional mortal wounds on a 6, like Illic does, that goes straight through. So if you're running 6 of them, right, statistically that's 1. If Illic succeeds, right, that's some pretty good mortal wound output. You're doing slightly more than 4 mortal wounds on average. Obviously, I'm sorry, you're doing slightly more than that. I misspoke. You're doing slightly more than 4 wounds on average, but only like 1.2 of those are mortal. And that's really the issue, is if you're coming up against enemies with good invuln saves, Voidbringer is not necessarily going to take them down. But if you are playing Alaitoc and you plan for the Rangers to be able to help you with secondaries also, this is potentially a play. And then Illic is incredibly difficult to remove, because with Pathfinders, the Rangers can only be hit on natural 6s, and they also have additional defensive buffs and cover. So their armor save is a little better. I think that it's at least, as an Alaitoc player, it's at least worth considering. He's far from being an auto include, but he's also not a purely narrative pick. So Alaitoc overview. Make use of that extra durability by thinking about long-range artillery units that will benefit from it, but don't rely on that extra durability to keep anything in particular alive. You probably do want to include at least 1 unit of Rangers and lean into secondary objectives that will benefit the flexibility of your very hard-to-kill, deep-striking Rangers. The Shift Shroud is probably worth taking a pass on, and Illic is a maybe. Craftworld Iyanden. Iyanden players have access to some potent bonuses, including what is probably the best Craftworlds relic in the game. That said, their default faction bonus is not good, really. And so we'll start with that, and then most of the things that I say after, well, there's also Prince Uriel to talk about. Okay, it's a mixed bag, Iyanden, but you have some powerful tools available to you, and you can run a solidly competitive list if you avoid certain traps. So here we go. Stoic Endurance is the subfaction ability for Craftworld Iyanden, and what this does is it gives Wraith units in Iyanden detachments the ability to never lose more than a single model as the result of a failed morale test. Also, units with damage charts, doesn't have to be a Wraith unit, any unit with a damage chart, performs as though it had double the number of wounds remaining for the purposes of determining which profile to use. Now, the first of these benefits is basically inconsequential. If you have enough models in a Wraith unit to risk losing any to morale, you are almost certainly going to play Insane Bravery anyway. And the only time it might not be worth playing Insane Bravery is maybe like there's 1 model left and you don't really need that one. It's not on an objective. It's damaged already. Well, 1 model runs anyway with the Iyanden subfaction bonus. So it's just, there will almost never be a time when it works for you. The damage chart benefit can come into play with Wraith Lords and certain tanks, but it looks way better than it actually is. It simply doesn't have that many ideal targets, because most of the popular Eldar vehicles and monsters don't have declining profiles. I'm thinking here of Warwalkers, Hornets, Wraith Seers, Vipers. None of those have declining profiles. The ones that do either stay totally out of line of sight, like Night Spinners, or aren't primarily concerned with target elimination anyway. Weirdly, the unit that stands to benefit most from this is probably the Lynx, which is not like thematically super Iyanden, but if you have a Lynx in your list and you're using Fire and Fade on something else, so the Lynx is relying on its long range and invulnerable save and 16 wounds to stay in the fight, then this could be good, you know? It keeps the Lynx viable longer. But it's just not that good a power. The temptation for Iyanden players wanting to both make use of Stoic Endurance and lean into an army narrative that is Iyanden appropriate is sometimes to triple down on Wraith Lords. Unfortunately, and honest, at the very beginning of 9th edition, that would have been a solid move. But unfortunately, as more factions get 9th edition codexes, this particular approach gets worse and worse and worse. There's so much anti-tank in the game right now that it's really hard for Wraith Lords to yield their value, their cost and value. So they are toughness 8, which is great, but they have no invulnerable save. And every updated faction seems to have some super anti-tank weapon that is maybe it's strength 9 or it's strength 8, but it's D3 plus 3 damage, and it goes -4 or -3 AP. It only takes a couple of hits from one of these weapons and modest damage rolls to totally annihilate a Wraith Lord, at which point the damage chart doesn't matter. Wraith Knights are in an even more tragic position with reference to Stoic Endurance, because super heavy Auxilia detachments don't have access to faction bonuses. A singleton Iyanden Wraith Knight doesn't even have Stoic Endurance. Now, I missed this. If you are thinking to yourself, you're not alone. I missed this for months. In fact, it was somebody who viewed one of my videos when I was talking about casual play and how you might use a Wraith Knight had to point out to me I had missed this in the 9th Ed rules, that for some reason heavy Auxilia detachments don't have access to sub-faction bonuses, as though it would make them too good. Maybe there was some concern about something that like a single knight could do allied to an ad necklace. I don't know. I have no idea why they made that choice. But in order to access Stoic Endurance for your Wraith Knights, you would need to run a detachment of 3 of them. And Eldar Knights are strong contenders for the worst Titanic models in the game. Wraith Knights are exclusively for casual, narrative, and apocalypse play. Now, that said, if you wish to pig-headedly push forward and do this, the Titanic Ghostglaives and Shields, so you have some kind of invuln save, are probably the way to go. And if you have 3 of them and they run at your opponent, it is likely that your opponent will not have enough anti-tank to deal with them. The problem is that they don't, when they get there, it's a little bit of a so what moment. They just don't do, they're good, but they don't do enough damage to warrant their tremendous expense, and they're not really helping you with secondaries either. But don't despair, Iyanden players. You can still run Wraith-oriented armies in competitive matchups. It's just that Wraith Lords and Wraith Knights are not your best options. And at the end of this segment, I'm going to talk about how to build the Wraith half of an Iyanden Wraith list so that you can perform in competitive play. Okay. Guided Wraith Sight. That's the Iyanden specific stratagem. It costs 1 CP, and it's really freaking good. It increases the range of a Spirit Seer's Spirit Mark ability to 12 inches and enables all affected units to reroll all failed hit rolls instead of just 1. So normally, a Spirit Seer has to be within 6 inches of the thing that you are fighting against. So it really only comes up with Wraith Blades and melee, and it allows your Wraith units to reroll hit rolls of 1. Well, now you can reroll all of your hit rolls, and it's at 12 inches. This is a considerable damage multiplier, especially for Wraith Blades with Ghost Axes and Shields. Partially because the Ghost Axes already carry a native -1 to hit, so they're missing half the time. So Guided Wraith Sight bumps their damage output by 50%, which is great. Axe and Shield Wraith Blades are already a top pick for objective control, even if you're not playing Iyanden. And this stratagem gives them serious potential also as a target elimination unit. Now, normally, the way to do this is to run Hunters of Ancient Relics and Expert Crafters. And that is the thing in most lists that makes your Wraith Blades effective at target elimination, because Hunters of Ancient Relics increases their damage output by 50%. But so does Guided Wraith Sight. And so an Iyanden player doesn't have to look at the person running the custom Craftworld list and think, oh, I wish my Wraithblades were as good as your Wraithblades and I'm running the Wraithblade faction. No. As long as you're popping the stratagem, they are. You can do it. It's fantastic. It also has really good synergy with the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is the Iyanden specific relic. Now, the Iyanden specific relic, the Pastronome of Iyanden, it works like this. At the start of the fight phase, the Iyanden Psyker carrying it activates it to double the attack characteristics of all friendly Iyanden Wraith Construct units within 6 inches. At the end of the phase, each affected unit takes D3 mortal wounds. Wraiths are pretty durable. D3 mortal wounds sucks, but it's totally worth it. This is probably the best relic in the whole codex. Here's why. 6 charging Wraithblades with Ghost Swords, buffed with this relic, put out 42 attacks at strength 6, AP -3, 1 damage. Now, if you are also popping Guided Wraith Sight, now they're also rerolling all of their failed hits. That is a lot. Now, you might be wondering how I got to 42, because the math here is a little bit weird. So when you declare the charge, the attack profile on Wraithblades goes from 2 to 3. That's just a unit ability that they have. Now, at the beginning of the fight phase, that doubles to 6, from 3 to 6. That's how you get to 36 attacks. The swords give you an additional attack, but the attacks from the swords don't double because they're not changing the actual attack characteristic, and that's why it's 42 and not 48. 48 would be great. 42 is still pretty amazing. So anyway, that's the math on that, if anyone was confused. Now, if you also cast Doom on your target, now this is getting a little bit intensive, right? Because we've used a stratagem, we've used a relic, and now if I Doom my target and I'm rerolling all my wound rolls, well, now I have 42 attacks. I'm rerolling all of my hits. I'm rerolling all of my wounds. And if your opponent has an invuln save, you will need to cast Jinx. But if you do, you can now kill pretty much anything in the game in a single round of combat. And that's amazing. Alternatively, the other way to use this, if you have a couple of Wraith Seers that are, say, countercharging a Demon Primarch, this same combo of powers I just described makes it possible to kill Mortarion or Magnus with those Wraith Seers, potentially. You need Jinx, but even a single Wraith Seer can hope to do about 10 damage with accounting for invulnerable saves and feel no pains. And if you are jinxing them, it gets even better. Because that Ghostglaive, that it hits super hard, D3 plus 3. And if you cast Witch Strike on them, it goes to D3 plus 5. That's a power that can replace Smite, if they cast it on themselves, rather. So no Iyanden force should ever take the field in competitive play without the Pastronome of Iyanden. It's just fabulous. And you need to have in mind the unit or units that you might want to use it on. You can only use it once, so have a plan. The Warlord trait, Enduring Resolve. It grants the recipient the ability to deny the Witch 1 additional time per turn. Don't take this. Most Eldar lists already have more denials than their opponents have psychic casts. I cannot imagine why anybody would take this instead of Seer of the Shifting Vector. I guess if you were playing a 500-point game and for some reason you didn't have a Psyker, but you would never do that because you need the Spirit Seer. Okay, this is my favorite thing to talk about in this whole video because it's so ridiculous. Prince Uriel. Prince Uriel is the special character from Iyanden. He is an autarch with a slightly juiced witch staff and a pistol that fires D6 shots at 3 inches, but can only be used once because it's apparently so good to have a pistol that fires D6 shots with a. It's ridiculous. It's not even a good pistol. In the fight phase, Uriel has to reroll saving throws of 6 to account for the fact that he's cursed and he can't take relics. Because I respect you, I will not explain why Prince Uriel has no place in a competitive list. It's just obvious. If you're not looking for an effective Craftworlds HQ, but instead you're looking for some sort of moody anime heartthrob whose likeness might grace the wall of a teenage goth girl's bedroom, then Prince Uriel is your elf. If, however, you are looking for a reliable HQ unit for 9th edition 40k, choose literally anything else in the Codex. So bad. Okay, a final note on Wraith units. So, there's no reason. It's true. Wraith Knights and Wraith Lords are not strong right now. But there's no reason why your competitive Iyanden list can't have approximately 50% of its points invested in Wraith units and Spirit Seers, as is thematically appropriate. Here's what I recommend as a core, a Wraithy core for your Iyanden list, and then you can build on this. At least one unit of at least 6 Wraith Blades with Ghost Swords in the Webway. You need to have a Psyker who is in position when they come out to cast Ghost Walk on them to give them +2 to their charge, and have a command reroll in reserve for the charge. So if they're coming in 9 inches away from an enemy, now they need, instead of a 9-inch charge, a 7-inch charge. And if you have a command reroll, well, the average roll on 2d6 is a 7. So you have like an 81 or 82% chance of succeeding on that charge. That's pretty darn good if you have the reroll. Make sure that Spirit Seer is in position, though, because the range on Guided Wraith Sight, which you're probably going to want to use, is somewhat limited. So alternatively, you can have a Psyker on a jet bike there with the Pastronome of Iyanden. Maybe you don't get Guided Wraith Sight every time, but this is an incredibly powerful target elimination move. You bring in this small-ish unit of incredibly elite melee blenders, and they just pulp something. But you have to set it up. You have to decide, am I going to use the Pastronome? If so, am I close enough? Am I going to use Guided Wraith Sight? If so, do I have the Spirit Seer in position? Am I close enough to cast Ghost Walk? And so on. The second unit that I think is non-negotiable is 6 Wraith Blades with Ghost Axes and Shields that are there to bully a midfield objective. Don't put them in a Serpent. They don't need a Wave Serpent. It's too many points. Wraiths are already expensive. Honestly, you're better off adding, instead of a Serpent, another unit of Wraith Blades with Ghost Axes for only a few more points. You can get to that midfield objective by using Matchless Agility on turn 1. That gives them an 11-inch move. And then on turn 2, they're going to be able to either move onto an objective or charge something on an objective. And at that point, you want to cast Protect on them, and maybe also Fortune to make them nigh on indestructible. So they've got a 3-up Invuln and a 5-up Feel No Pain. You obviously need, in this list, a Spirit Seer with either Protect Jinx or Quicken Restrain. Quicken's great on Ghost Axes, but again, Matchless Agility. You don't need to use up a Psychic cast or a Psychic power slot in your list. If you have a single unit of Ghost Axes playing for the midfield on turn 1, you can Matchless Agility. It's so good. Wraith Seers. I think in your Iyanden list, at the very least, you want one Wraith Seer with the glaive and the shoulder-mounted D-cannon, and swap out Smite for Fateful Divergence. The D-cannon hits incredibly hard. It's an indirect fire weapon, and if you have Fateful Divergence, you can make up for the possibility that it doesn't generate. So the way the D-cannon hits incredibly hard, but it's D3 shots, so it can be super fickle. And then with a ballistic skill of 3, it wounds almost anything on a 2, and definitely anything on a 3 that it doesn't wound on a 2. But with a BS of 3, there's a big opportunity to miss. So I've said in the past, in my unit focus video on the Wraith Seer, I mentioned that you probably need expert crafters in order for the shoulder-mounted D-cannon to really make sense, because being able to reroll a hit and reroll a wound makes it reliable enough that the 40 points you have to spend on it is no longer incredibly soul-destroying to decide. But Fateful Divergence is like mini expert crafters. It lets you reroll either the hit roll or the wound roll. It's a psychic power, so you can only cast it once. It has a low warp charge value. It's easy to pull off. And so a single Wraith Seer with a D-cannon, I think, is a pretty good move. It operates much like it would in a crafter's list. You might even run a second one that doesn't have the shoulder-mounted D-cannon, because the Titanic Ghost Glaive it carries is absolutely brutal, and you can give it the power Witch Strike instead of Smite, which causes it to, instead of do D3 plus 3 when it hits with a Ghost Glaive, it does D3 plus 5. Just chew on that for a moment. D3 plus 5 is harder hitting than the Titanic Ghost Glaive that our Wraith Knight carries. that's insane. You do have to get it into combat, but they don't have declining profiles. They do have invuln saves. And what you do is you keep them out of line of sight in the early part of the game. That's why those D cannons are so good. You might only want one with the D cannon to blast opponent's units in the midfield. And then it emerges once your opponent has fewer heavy weapons on the table to threaten it because you've done some damage to the army, to just be a monster in the midfield with its toughness 8 and its Titanic Ghost Glaive, and it still has that shoulder-mounted D cannon. You may only want to run one of these things and instead take the 170 points that you would have put into a second one with a shoulder-mounted D cannon and buy yourself some more Wraith Blades, maybe 2 units of Wraith Swords in the webway, right? That could be a play too. But at least one Wraith Seer and a whole bunch of Wraith Blades are solid picks. There's nothing wrong with a unit of Wraiths with the cannons popping out of the webway to blast something. D6 is a little bit fickle. They do hit hard. They don't have an invuln, which is a bummer. If you position them carefully, though, they can be a real problem in your opponent's backfield. If you can get guide on them, right, those cannons will do more work for you. I don't think they're as good as the Wraith Blades, but if you need some more shooting in your army, it's definitely a more Iyanden-y choice than a unit of fire dragons that jump in and out of a transport that zips around the field. Not that you shouldn't do that. That's a solid competitive move. So it should be pretty easy with those suggestions to get to 1,000 points. And I think they really will do good work for you. And then the rest of your list will do all of the things that a Craftworlds list would usually do. You have to think about how you're going to play primary objectives other than with your Wraith Blades, and how are you going to score secondaries, and so on. So that's it. Playing mainstream Craftworlds and taking a pass on expert crafters. I think that all of the mainstream Craftworlds do really have good options for competitive play. If you have your own ideas about what works well for mainstream Craftworlds, please feel free to leave those in the comments below, or maybe share a list. I always enjoy that. If you liked the video, I would appreciate if you clicked like, and you could even leave a comment saying, I liked this. And maybe even follow the channel. Clicking like and following the channel encourages me to keep making these videos at a good rate. All right, that's it for today, guys. I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then.